Welcome to episode 8 of the GoblinCast, and today's podcast will be completely on Young Griff. We're going to talk about in the first part if he is truly a Targaryen, and then in part 2 we'll go through the opposite theory and if he actually is a Blackfyre. And then in part 3 we're going to talk about Daenerys and Young Griff's interactions given the rumors about his parentage. What will Daenerys find out before she even meets him? What will their interactions be like, and will it lead to a second Dance of the Dragons? And so sit back and enjoy as we dive into Young Griff.
So let's kind of get into this. So the first thing I think we have to look at is, let's look at a little bit of the backstory. Is this plausible that he is Aegon? So again, something we get in the first book that's very apparent is that Aegon's body, you can't really see it. Like, it's all wrapped in this red crimson cloak just to, because it's a horrifying sight. You have this kid just dead. His skull has been crushed, basically. It's a really bad scene. So Tywin wraps it up so you can't really see it too much. And so, yeah, it's very plausible that this could be someone else that isn't Aegon. Just given the fact that we're not given a real description or really able to identify who this kid was to begin with. So in the backstory, it already checks out, right? It's very plausible to think that Varys could have gotten Aegon out. That's not where I think a lot of the holes in this theory really start. I think that part of it is all plausible. So let's kind of skip to some of the events of Dance when we meet this character of Young Griff, because that's where we have to pull a lot of the information that we have here. So the first thing I think we need to look at is the last chapter of Dance. And so the last chapter is very important because the scene where it's only Varys and Kevin. And Kevin is dying, right? So Varys has shot him with a crossbow. Again, very similar to Tywin's death. It's actually very tragic in that way. Again, always Kevin living in Tywin's shadow, and they die the same way. A little different, but kind of the same way. It's really to play on Cersei's paranoia, to pit her more and more against the Tyrells, and also just more paranoia against Tyrion and all that. So the important part of this, though, is that Varys, in this moment where it's a dying Kevin and just him, he says that Young Griff is legit, that he is Aegon. And now my biggest argument for why I could see why this makes sense for Aegon is that, again, he is stating it to him. And even here, it's like, if this was a lie, right? If Young Griff is a Blackfyre and Varys knows it, he's not going to say that here, one, because he's trying to convince, himself more than anyone that he is actually Aegon. Two, you never know who's listening in King's Landing, right? Varys would know that more than any person on the planet. So to me, I think, you can argue this on a lot of ways, right? If you're coming at this from a Blackfyre, a Targaryen route, I think this line is probably the biggest evidence for Young Griff being a Targaryen or being actually Aegon, just based upon the fact of the context of why Varys is saying it. So again, I think, it's evidence that can be manipulated for each theory, but it'll be used in the Blackfyre one as well, just kind of as a counterpoint. But in this video, we'll leave it there. So the next kind of part of evidence is to kind of look at some of the characters that have identified this character as Aegon. So the first one is Tyrion. So Tyrion is someone that's able to come to the conclusion that this is Aegon. And he doesn't say that he's a Blackfyre. He doesn't pick up on any of that. He picks up on that he is this Targaryen prince. And that's very significant looking at the idea that Tyrion's very smart. He's someone that picks up on a lot of context clues and a lot of things. And Young Griff does display a lot of Targaryen features and habits. Now, the problem with differentiating those habits with Blackfyre habits is very difficult to do because Blackfyres are Targaryens. They're just a different branch. It's very similar to like the Starks and say the Karstarks, for instance. It's kind of in that realm, basically, of different lines. But yeah, so that's why I think it's very difficult when you look at Young Griff and you go, okay, he has really good leadership qualities. Well, so do a lot of the Blackfyres, right? Daemon Blackfyre, that was one of his best qualities. So there's a lot of problems when you look at Young Griff's character. You're like, oh, well, he has a lot of Valyrian features. So do the Blackfyres. That's kind of the issue with that, is like there's no real way to look at that and go, okay, this is defining more for this side than it is for this side, because they both look the same. And in a lot of cases, Daemon Blackfyre looked more Targaryen, more Valyrian than even some of the Targaryens of the age. Notably, if you look at Baelor Breakspear, he was someone that looked more Dornish than he did, Valyrian at the time. And so that's really, a point of contention, right? If you even want to look at that idea. And so moving on, we have Jon Con. Now, Jon Con was someone that knew Rhaegar really well, and he is someone that is also fully, believing that this child is Rhaegar's. And a part of him, I think, again, this is, just to play devil's advocate for why he could be a Blackfyre here, is like, Jon Con wants Young Griff to be a legit, son of Rhaegar, because it's for him personally, he can redeem himself. Like, he was partly responsible for why the Targaryens fell because of how he handled the whole situation with Robert and him being trapped and not being able to find him. That's part of the reason, right? So there's some of that own stuff there from Jon Con that he wants this to be true, right? And also it's like, Aegon, if this is Aegon or if it's not Aegon, they were a young kid regardless. Like, there's no real way to like confirm that this really is Rhaegar's kid at that point. And so I'd be interested to see like how that conversation went down with Jon Con, and Varys or Illyrio. Like, how did this all go down? I mean, I think that's something that'd be really interesting to explore in the next book. But again, I think it is significant that Jon Con believes that this is Rhaegar's child, but at the same time, you can also look at some counterpoints as well. And that's kind of the big thing with a lot of the evidence here is like, even when we get to the Blackfyre evidence as well, there's ways that you can interpret them differently, which makes me so interested in Young Griff's character because like a lot of people have discussed, like Young Griff is a character that we may never get the identity to, right? George may just leave it to where it's like, maybe Dany thinks she's a Blackfyre, but us, the readers, maybe we think he actually is a Targaryen based on new evidence that is brought up, or maybe it's vice versa, right? So there's a lot of that going on where it could just be hearsay, right? We think maybe he's a Blackfyre, but we don't know. Or we think he's a Targaryen, but we don't know. We never get that information to confirm that. So I think that's really interesting and significant as well. So some other stuff I want to look at here with the Targaryen theory is the three heads of the dragon. So we know that there's kind of this idea of the Targaryens having the three heads of the dragon. It's what Rhaegar was trying to do with his children. You look at Aegon and his two sisters. So I think, to me, a lot of people, if you're going to say he's a Targaryen, you would go, oh, well, Aegon's going to be one of the three heads of the dragon, right? He's probably going to get, Viserion, or he's going to get Rhaegal. You do kind of actually run into an interesting idea if also Aegon and Jon had the same father, so they're actually much more closely related than Dany, which would be really interesting to see how that plays out. Who would get Rhaegal? Both of them being children of Rhaegar. That'd be really interesting. But yeah, so maybe you sit here and you go, okay, Aegon's one of the heads of the dragon. He's gonna ride a dragon. Now, one of the other facets that I forgot to bring up that I mentioned in the first video, because I did some little bit of research just to refresh my memory on some of the key points for this video, is that there was a point when George confirmed that there was going to be a second Dance of the Dragons. Now, okay, there's a lot of options that we have here. One of those options is if Young Griff, gets a dragon, and again, this doesn't even play on if he is a Targaryen or a Blackfyre, right? Like, he still has that dragon blood. If we even look at the dragon seeds, right? During the Dance of the Dragons, they were not full Targaryens either. In a lot of cases, some of them were Velaryons or whatever. And so you sit here and you go, okay, technically Young Griff doesn't need to be a Targaryen. But to call it a Dance of the Dragons when the main conflict was between Targaryens or different branches of Targaryens, you would maybe assume, okay, that this could be some evidence that Young Griff is a Targaryen. Now, like I said, this is very highly interpretable because the main whole conflict was between the dragons. So you could say if Euron gets a dragon, for instance, you could have the Dance of the Dragons between Euron and Dany, okay? For instance, like that. There's a lot of different routes you can kind of go with that idea of the Dance of the Dragons that George talked about, his second one anyway. But I think, when we get into the Blackfyre evidence, I'm going to cite some other things that I think will be interesting to see how you guys interpret them. Do you think maybe it's actually evidence for the Targaryens or whatnot?
I think Dany's clash with Aegon will paint her in a villainous light. Yeah, I think so. There's a lot of things that are interesting about Aegon and Daenerys. Is I think Daenerys will already be painted in a bad light, and so that any action that she does, especially if she takes down Aegon, in my opinion, will be, public perception will go against her. And so I think that's a really fascinating idea because you look at Daenerys, and I've talked about this so much. You think about the way that she went about doing things in Essos, right? Where he was somebody that after book one, he was somebody that had people around her that loved her because of her actions, right? Leading the Dothraki, freeing the Unsullied, freeing slaves, all these things. He was somebody that is well loved and respected and all those things in Essos. Well, I shouldn't say well loved, right? The slavers don't love her, stuff like that, but she has a pretty good support base, right? When she comes to Westeros, that's going to be completely different. She's going to have almost no support, right? There's not going to be a lot of support for Daenerys in terms of the public. The public is going to view Daenerys as a foreign invader. She's going to get the absolute opposite of what Aegon gets. Now, there's a couple reasons for that. One, as much as the dragons show legitimacy for the Targaryens, people do not like the dragons, right? The dragons are basically a show that at any point the Targaryens could come and burn down your villages, burn down your homes, burn down your castles, and you are really powerless to do anything about that, right? So if you didn't have a dragon, you wanted the dragons to disappear, right? There's a reason that, for instance, perfect example, Rhaena Targaryen, the Queen of the West in Fire and Blood, not the Rhaena during the dance, but the Rhaena, the older sister of Jaehaerys, she was put onto this idea, right? She would go to castle, and people would try to basically court her to get her maybe her dragon or trying to get dragon eggs, trying to buy those things. And eventually she would feel like she needed to leave. She was kind of being pushed out of each of one of these castles. That's how people would view the dragons. So there's going to be a bit of that, right? People don't like the dragons. They remember the horror stories of Harrenhal and, maybe Maegor's reign or war on, the faith, or they remember the dance, or these stories about the dragons. Then you're going to put that with, okay, she's coming over with this unsullied army. A lot of people in Westeros would view it kind of as like a sellsword army. The Dothraki, the perfect way to describe it is the way Viserys thinks about the Dothraki in book one. That's not just because Viserys is, who he is. That's the sentimentality of all of Westeros. Really. So you have these foreign armies coming over. You have Daenerys coming over with the dragons. And all of the while, Aegon, by the time Daenerys even gets to Westeros, will likely already be on the throne, or at least about to be. So you're going to be coming over here going, okay, well, Aegon's already retaken the throne. So, okay, if Daenerys is coming over, that means Daenerys is either going to marry Aegon or she's going to, support his claim, whatever she's going to do. Nobody would expect Daenerys to go against Aegon. And again, a lot of the public is not going to maybe believe something like, oh, Aegon's a Blackfyre, he's not a true Targaryen, because Aegon will probably already be well loved by the public. The public is not going to accept the word of Daenerys, this, again, foreign invader who's trying to legitimize her claim. Then you put it with the prejudice that people have against women ruling, and you can already see, you can connect these dots where Aegon will be viewed really well, and Daenerys will not be. It's kind of almost a similar manner. I wouldn't say as distinctively because Rhaenyra had a lot of people that supported her in Westeros, but it's kind of the people that maybe go against Rhaenyra. It would be their argument. Like that's what people may argue against Daenerys and her claim. And so that's the tough part of it is Daenerys in her mind, based on information she's probably going to get from Quaithe, possibly Illyrio and Pentos, whoever else, she's going to come to probably the conclusion that he's not actually a Targaryen. And so she's going to have all this information that she knows in her heart that he is basically taking their family off the throne. Even though the Blackfyres are Targaryens, still the Blackfyres, they are big enemies of the Targaryens. You have that aspect of it. And then you look at Young Griff, who is kind of your model prince, your model king. It's kind of, he plays the part, right? Varys is going to be manipulating the public to go with him. I think the faith will like Aegon more than, for instance, the Lannister regime at the moment. Daenerys is going to be coming over at the worst possible time because people don't want another war. They don't want more of the War of the Five Kings. They want some peace and stability to go back to be able to farm, to prepare for the winter, prepare for all these different things. And so I think it's a really, interesting discussion point that was brought up about the two characters of Illyrio and Daenerys. So, or not Illyrio, I should say Young Griff and Daenerys. But yeah, really good discussion points. Why it's one of my favorite plots going forward. Daenerys and Aegon will probably be similar to Dany versus Jon in the show. I think they definitely will take elements of that, right? I think there definitely could be that, where Daenerys and Aegon, maybe Daenerys is trying to make a good relationship with Aegon. I personally don't think we'll get to see a love thing between Aegon and Daenerys, because I think that Young Griff has already shown signs of having a temper, of being somebody that can be quite arrogant. We see this specifically in when Tyrion and Young Griff are playing Savas. That kind of comes out. And you see that a young kid, right? I don't care who you are. It is very difficult to possess traits of power not corrupting you at how young of an age Young Griff is, or Aegon is. And you got to think about everything that's going to be happening. In the span of just like maybe a couple months, Young Griff will go to being the king of Westeros, possibly marrying Arianne or Marjorie, Sansa, whoever you think, all those things, and having absolute power that quickly. I personally think that's going to go to his head a bit. I think that's going to really also change that relationship between Daenerys and Young Griff, whereas Young Griff, like Tyrion said before, was kind of going to Daenerys as a beggar, more or less, kind of like Quentyn is. Really, Quentyn is what I would say. Quentyn is a worse version of Young Griff, because at least Young Griff was going to have like an actual physical army he was bringing to Daenerys in the Golden Company. But yeah, so with that being said, Young Griff is going to look at Daenerys like, where were you? I was the one avenging our family, all these things, because he's not going to know he's a Blackfyre or anything like that. He's the one that brought the Targaryens back to the throne, not Daenerys. Daenerys is disrupting the peace that he's already set forward. So, again, I really love the Daenerys and Aegon conversation. The Greens crowned Aegon II to give him legitimacy. That's true. I think the same will be kind of true of Young Griff, though, right? Like, I think something similar, for instance, is I think the sword Blackfyre, Aegon I's sword, probably will be given to Young Griff upon maybe his coronation around that time. I think he will be kinged for all of those reasons. I think Illyrio and Varys very much will push for that as well.